Let's sew up this half zip. I'm using the collar here. This also works for the lined hood option. You're going to sew your main collar or hood to the neckline. Shouldn't be any stretching, should fit 1 to 1. We're going to take our zipper and sew in our zipper. So you want your zipper stop 1/2 inch from the top. And then I'm also going to be careful to mark where this seam is on both sides so that when I align the other zipper tape to the other side, it's nice and easy to line up perfectly. I'm just going to mark both sides. I'm going to have to shorten this zipper. I'm going to speed up and skip where I'm shortening this zipper. We do have YouTube videos that show how to shorten the zipper if you need help with that. Otherwise, I just don't want to bore you while I pry these metal zipper teeth off my zipper. You want your zipper stop to start 1/2 inch from the bottom raw edge of your pattern piece. You don't want your needle to be sewing through any of the teeth, so you do not want any teeth at the 1/2 inch mark or below it. I'm just pinning this on 1 to 1, should not be stretching. If your fabric has any kind of vertical stretch, you really need to make sure to use some interfacing so that it does not stretch. If you skip that step, your zipper can come out all wonky if you accidentally ease it in or stretch the fabric at all. What I'm going to do now is baste this zipper onto this side using about a 3/8 inch seam allowance and a zipper foot. I do highly recommend basting here. It's so much easier to pull out if you don't get your seam allowance even. If it doesn't line up perfectly and you need to take anything apart and try again, the basting makes it so much easier and stress-free. You can see me lengthening my straight stitch so that it is a basting stitch. Sorry, I wobbled the camera. If you've watched any of the other videos for the half zip, you'll know that I'm really struggling with this new phone holder and not hitting it and wobbling it. As you're going over the seam where the collar or hood meets the neckline, make sure you help your foot kind of over that bulkier area. You don't want it to skip stitches there or get stuck, either one. You want to make sure that you're not sewing too close to your zipper teeth, especially if, like me, you have a really plush kind of furrier fabric. You don't want that getting stuck in your zipper teeth as you're trying to zip it up and down. And you do want to make sure it's nice and even. When you get to the point where you need to move your zipper, make sure your needle stays down. If you don't, you'll have a little jump in your stitches, and you don't want that. Even in your basting stitches, it'll make it harder to pull out or harder later on for your final stitch to be nice and even. So you can check it here, and I do always recommend checking. You just want to make sure your seam allowance is nice and even. You want to make sure that your zipper pull can go up easily, you didn't get too close to your teeth anywhere, and that your marking on the other side is nice and even with that seam allowance right there. Well, seam line right there, excuse me. So I'm going to match up that pin right to my seam on this one. I am pressing this seam allowance up toward the collar. That is important for later on. I didn't mention that on the other side. And we're just going to do the same thing, not stretching either side. Pinning, making sure that we're nice and even on that other side. I like to turn it around and just double check that this seam line is perfect. It's something that your naked eye can really tell if it's off, especially if you have maybe different fabrics. I have the same fabric, so it's not quite so noticeable, But in a solid fabric, or you're using two different fabrics, it's really noticeable if that seam line doesn't line up perfectly. So turn it around and check. Once we baste this on, I'm gonna check it again. And sometimes, it shifts and moves as it's going through the machine, and you can pull that basting stitch and make sure it's nice and perfect, at least to your own eye, so that it doesn't look off when you're all done sewing it up. So the same thing, you want to use the same seam allowance here. Get your needle exactly the same distance away from the teeth as you did on the other side. Go nice and slowly and make sure you maintain that seam allowance really evenly. Nothing is being stretched here. The fabric isn't being stretched at all. As you go through, your zipper will not stretch, so you're just making sure that your fabric won't stretch. If it has interfacing like it needs, you're golden, okay? Don't try to skip that interfacing unless, like me, your fabric has zero stretch vertically. My fabric will not stretch at all in any way vertically, so I skipped the interfacing. But if it stretches at all, even just a little bit vertically, you need to have that interfacing. Go nice and slow around the zipper stops so you can make sure to maintain that perfect seam allowance. All right, so we're gonna take it off the machine and check one more time to make sure our tops are lining up, our bottoms lining up, our seam allowances are all even, and that seam at the collar or hood is lining up perfectly. All right, now we are going to unzip it and take our lining piece. So either the lining to the hood or the lining to the collar. Obviously, I'm doing a collar here. And we're gonna stitch the lining to the main fabric. I like to go nice and slow and baste in a few places first. We are basically going to sew up the front one more time, exactly where we did, just stitching in the ditch. And then we're going to sew all along the top. I like to take it nice and slowly because it's going to be very obvious if anything isn't perfectly aligned. So as you can see, I'm flipping up and making sure that my zipper stop is right at that 1/2 inch. I put it at the 1/2 inch, but I'm just making sure I get my pin exactly where that zipper stop is, or at least as close as I can, so that I know my stitch line is going to be just a little bit above that zipper stop, but not much. You obviously don't want your needle going through the zipper stop, but you do want a lot of space above that. Right? When you zip it up, you want that zipper stop to be at the very top. I'm just making sure they're nice and even, making sure that those pins are going to line up. I'm just going to baste right where those pins are at the front and double check it again. Once again, just because this is an area where if it's off a little bit, your naked eye is going to be able to really see that it's off when it's all zipped up. So I'm going to be really careful and meticulous on this certain spot. So I just based for maybe 2 inches, not very much. Just want to make sure this corner right here is perfect. Okay. So this is what it will look like when we're all done. I'm going to baste the other side and just make sure they line up. I left my zipper foot on here. You can change to your normal foot if that's easier. I just left it on until I was done top stitching the zipper, but you can switch back and forth if that's easier for you. Okay, so I'm gonna zip it up and make sure that the top is exactly perfect. Mine was not. if you can see, I have a tiny bit more room on this one. I'm right on, perfect, right above the zipper stop. This one, I have a tiny bit more room, and it didn't line up perfectly for me right there. Had a little bit extra, so I'm going to rebaste and just take a teeny tiny bit more seam allowance so that my needle is slightly closer to that zipper stop. Check it again, make sure it is close enough to perfect for me this time. There we go, and now they both stop just right above that zipper stop. So zip it up, and they should be perfectly even at the top. I was happy with it now. They look nice and even for me. Now I like to baste along this front edge. So we're gonna end up folding our lining up about 3/8 of an inch at the bottom. You wanna make sure when you fold it up that it is meeting the seam line of the main collar or hood to your bodice, okay? That's where it's gonna align, and we're gonna top stitch them all together at the end. If you took all your seam allowances perfectly, it's folding up about 3/8. It's in between 3/8 of an inch and a 1/2 inch. Because you do want it to slightly cover that seam line. So it's just under 1/2 an inch will be perfect. Okay, so you want to stitch in the ditch here to your very first base to the zipper. And so your front and your back should basically look exactly the same here. The front should have a little bit of zipper teeth, and the back should have the exact same distance from the zipper teeth as your front does. I'm going to do that on the other side. What this method does is it covers your zipper teeth and your seam allowance, at least for this top little part, so that if you don't like doing the binding all along the zipper teeth or the binding along the neckline, this still gives you a really beautiful finish without having to do the binding. It does not work for an unlined hood. If you do not want to line your hood, this will only work if you have that lining piece to cover this section. Again, we're stitching in the ditch here, going right at the exact same stitch line that we basted before. I do like to baste again here to make sure it's perfect before doing any final stitches. Now I also just leave these basting stitches in. My fabric doesn't have much stretch. If your fabric has a ton of stretch, you might want to eventually remove these basting stitches, but I leave them. Okay, now that we're making sure everything looks nice on our basting, it's all looking great for me, what we're going to do is final stitch and then final stitch across the top as well. I use my serger for across the top. I'm going to make sure you press that afterwards. I'm sorry for my camera wobbling a little bit. This phone stand just wasn't real great at being steady. I'm using my bamboo little stick to make sure this corner is nice and squared off. You can use whatever little, I know there's a purple thing, a couple little tools you can use for poking out your corners. Again, I've done a final stitch there, so it's not just basted all along there. Another wobble on the phone. Okay. Here's the step that's going to take us the very longest in this method, because you have to be pretty meticulous here. You're going to press that seam, and what we're going to do is we're going to use our lining to cover up the seam all along the bottom of the neckline. So we're going to fold it under about 3/8 inch to a 1/2 inch. We want it to cover that seam right there, and pin it in place, just like that. A trick you can use is using some kind of adhesive. If you find this really frustrating and you can't get it to stay, some people will use things like temporary adhesive spray. Some people will use like a wash away hem tape. I just use pins. I'm just pretty meticulous when I am pinning. I also like to press a lot. If I had different fabric, I would have pre-pressed this collar 3/8 inch up, but mine was furry and it just, you couldn't press it very much, and if I did press it a little bit, it wasn't gonna hold. So I had to do it the slow and meticulous way. If you have fabric that holds a press really easily, this will be a much easier step for you. You can go ahead and pre-press that bottom lining of your collar or your hood up 3/8, and it should fold right down and be perfect for you. If you're like me and your little one chose the furriest, softest, cuddliest fabric, you're gonna have to do it like me. So we're just tucking in the raw ends, making sure that bottom fold just barely covers the seam line. You don't want it to dip down far below your seam line. You shouldn't have enough fabric that should be that easy anyways, but you want it just barely covering that seam line, because what we're going to do is top stitch this seam, and that will not only top stitch the main collar or hood, it will also stitch down this lining. It's a little bit finicky, but it gives a really beautiful finish on the inside and the outside without any extra binding or bias binding or anything like that. If we don't have any to match, this is a great way to finish it off. I recommend basting on this step. What we're going to do is top stitch all along. You want to make sure all of your pins are coming through exactly where you want that top stitch. There's no nothing's getting caught, a little bobble, a little pucker. Just check both sides before you go in. If you want to add in a tag, now's your chance. I picked this one just because it matched. I usually don't put tags in anything unless it's outerwear. We're a sensitive group here and we don't like the way the tags feel on our skin if it's red on our skin. But since this will be worn over something else, I love to use the cute little tags. So we're going to top stitch everything here. We're going to top stitch along the neckline. We're going to top stitch along the top, along the zippers, all of it. I'm going in the zipper first because I have my zipper foot on still and I'm ready to take that off. So I'm just going to top stitch down the zippers with our final stitch. We don't need to baste anymore. Everything's nice and perfect. I top stitch about 1/4 of an inch away maybe. It's really personal preference here though. Whatever you like the look of. You do want to make sure your fabric isn't stretching. If you interfaced, you should be stitching through all interfacing right here, so it shouldn't be a problem. But just make sure again it's not getting eased in, no puckers or anything. When you need to move your zipper, make sure you leave the needle down. You can lift the foot up, just don't lift your needle up. That way you won't get any funky little stitch lines. There we go. So I'm just going to top stitch down the other zipper side as well. Using the same seam allowance that I did on the other side. Go nice and slow, especially over the thicker seam at the neckline. Make sure you're not getting stuck there and you're not skipping stitches there either. It's usually helpful to put one hand kind of on the back of your fabric and one at the front to make sure it's going to move smoothly over that. Sometimes I use a pin to kind of help push it through as well. I want to be careful. You still want to let your machine lead the way here. You don't want to push or pull through it. You just don't want it to get stuck on that bulkier seam right there. Now here I'm turning and I'm leaving my zipper foot on, and I'm going to top stitch all along this top seam. You can take off your zipper foot and change it out for your normal foot. I was just being a little lazy here and leaving it on. It doesn't matter. If you find it much easier with your regular foot to keep a nice even seam allowance, or you're just used to it, go ahead and change it out. And you don't actually have to top stitch along this top seam. I prefer to, but it is optional. You must top stitch your zipper, and you must top stitch the bottom seam, but this along the top of the neckline or collar is optional, or along the hood. I like to top stitch both the collar and the hood, but it's personal preference. The seam allowance is also personal preference. I think I did about a quarter of an inch here as well. Whatever you like the look of. All right, and we're gonna take it off the machine. It'll need a good press afterwards. Always want to make sure you top stitch before, always want to make sure you press before you top stitch and again after you top stitch on any garment ever. So we're going to do this bottom neckline. You can stitch it from the right sides. I do switch out my sewing machine foot here to my normal classic regular old foot. So you can do it just like this, like a top stitch, or you can do it from the wrong side like this, like a top stitch, whatever you find the easiest. I'm going to stitch from the inside, the wrong side. I find it slightly easier most of the time. I can double check and make sure everything's folded under exactly as I'm moving along, especially if my fabric doesn't hold a press like this furry fabric I have. If it holds a press, it's a little easier to do from the right side because you know that fold is holding for you. You can try it out both ways if you're not sure which way you prefer, and see which one is easier for you. I'm using about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance here to top stitch this. Again, it's a top stitch and stitching this lining down all in one stitch. I like to stitch from the underside too, especially if I'm using a tag, so I can make sure that tag is in there just so as well. If you really prefer stitching from the right side and you want a tag, just make sure you baste it in before you do your final stitch. If your fabric is super easy to work with and you've done this method several times, you can skip the baste, but if you are learning this method or your fabric is really tricky to work with, I highly recommend taking the time to run a basting stitch here. Make sure it's perfect before doing your final stitch. You shouldn't need to stretch anything or ease anything in. This collar piece should be the exact same size as your main collar piece, so it should fit nice and perfectly. Right, there we go. You can't see my basting stitch very well, but there it is. It's black, so it's a little hard to see against the fabric. Needs a nice press, But that's it. We're all done. I didn't follow my own advice and use a basting stitch there, but I do recommend that if you're a beginner or if your fabric is tricky to work with. I hope you like this method. It's a nice little finishing method. If you don't want to add a zipper guard, you don't want to do binding on the zippers, it covers that top little section at least and your neckline for when you wear it unzipped and opened. Don't forget to share yours with me. I love seeing your creations.